You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 335 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the arrest of Julian Assange. Ecuador revoked his asylum and he was turned over to the UK authorities. I want to talk about Iran's response to the US labeling the IRGC a terrorist organization. And in Sudan, it appears the longtime dictator is on his way out. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and the daily news roundup that I write are featured on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. The arrest of Julian Assange is a huge story, but today, we're only going to be able to discuss the small piece of it that we currently know. And so if you subscribe to this show, I'll be updating it, I'm guessing, pretty frequently in the months to come here. So the show's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. Please subscribe to it, and if you can, give it a rating and review. And then patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus if you want to donate. All right, so I guess going back to Monday's show, where I had really talked about the lead up of Assange's relationship with the Ecuadorian government, had really deteriorated since the current president took over. The first major event is the Catalan independence referendum, where, we have video of Spanish police just beating innocent people trying to go out and vote, saying that they believe they're their own country, they're their own people, they're not part of Spain. And, well, it made sense why, if the Spanish police come into Catalonia and beat them while they go out and vote for independence. Assange weighs in on this on Twitter, has his internet access cut, I believe was denied visitors for quite some time, and then eventually had some of his internet access restored, although has not been able to publicly speak out. And, his communications are heavily monitored. I discussed this a few episodes ago, but I'll link to the Cassandra Fairbanks article where she explains what the situation was like when she went to try to interview Julian Assange. Heavy security of his communications. There was no way, I guess, for them to speak off the record. And while she was supposed to have 2 hours to meet with him, was only given about 8 minutes, and overheard arguments between Assange and the staff at the embassy. The situation with Ecuador and Assange reaches a boiling point when leaked documents that show corruption by the Ecuadorian president are exposed by an Ecuadorian lawmaker. Now, the Ecuadorian president blamed WikiLeaks for publishing this information, but that wasn't the case. The leaks were given from an associate of the president to a lawmaker and then revealed. And WikiLeaks apparently was only involved in the promotion of, hey, that these papers exist and, possibly, did some reporting on it, but not actually facilitating the leaking of the documents or publishing them. And so that was a major hole in the president's case. And it seemed like with these documents showing pretty solid corruption, and knowing that the former president of the country had been removed from office due to a corruption scandal, that, this guy was probably on his way out and, then maybe wouldn't have the leverage to turn Assange over. Also, there were reports in the Ecuadorian media that said that the report that was put out by WikiLeaks that Assange was going to be have his asylum revoked within days, and that was last Thursday or Friday. They said that was just rumors. So a few days passed, and it seems like, maybe it was rumors, or that the president backed out on, his plans to turn Assange over. This was the analysis that I talked about on Monday's show from Jose Rivera, who was on last week's Unity for J visual for Julian Assange. And I'm sure there's going to be another one going on this Friday and possibly the whole weekend. So make sure you check out that YouTube channel, because it's going to be a bunch of great stuff. All the things that I'm not covering on today's show, like how we ended up here for Julian Assange, as far as the documents that WikiLeaks put out and the importance of them, will all be discussed there. also a lot of nuanced background on the case. They usually have John Kiriakou on to discuss what it was like for him when he went through the same courtroom that Assange will likely go through if he's extradited to the United States. And so this morning as I wake up, I see, just a couple minutes ago that Julian Assange had been arrested in the UK. I didn't see anything that looked like he was assaulted or, he gave a thumbs up. It didn't. So, that kind of unfolds. I guess he's now in UK custody, and I'm not sure what the next steps are other than I've seen the UK government put out a statement that they're not going to turn him over to a country with the death penalty. Now, my guess is that the US will pretty quickly make an offer that they will guarantee the UK government not to utilize the death penalty against Julian Assange. There are, I guess, other legal routes to go with Julian Assange. There was some rape charges from Sweden that have since been dropped. And I believe the UN ruling on those charges were that the detention he was facing in the Ecuadorian embassy was arbitrary, which my interpretation of that meant that the rape allegations would be unfounded. There is apparently a bail that was, Julian Assange agreed to and then didn't appear to the UK court as he went and sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, Assange has been in asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy for all this time because everybody is under the belief, I think including most of the people who are anti-Julian Assange and anti-WikiLeaks, that he will be turned over, extradited from the UK to the US, where he will face charges related to the 2010 Manning leak and possibly violations of the Espionage Act for publishing classified material. As I mentioned, there was a document unsealed, and this indictment says Julian Assange is being charged with conspiracy and alleges that he worked with Chelsea Manning to, I believe, encourage her to release all these documents, of course, those being the Afghan and Iraq war cables, the State Department documents, and documents about Guantanamo Bay, and also helped to get access to a password that unleaked more documents. From my understanding, the trial in 2010 of Chelsea Manning pretty clearly concluded that Julian Assange didn't play a part in these leaks, and there, like I said, from what I know in that trial, there was no proof that he helped, steal these passwords or anything like that. So I'm not quite sure what the government is going to use as evidence here, as Chelsea Manning is refusing to testify, and they did an extensive investigation back in 2010. So unless there's an indication of what new evidence here, I can't see how he would, be convicted in any kind of just courtroom on those charges. Now, the other thing is that there is the potential that he could be charged under the Espionage Act because he possessed and made public classified information and he didn't have authority to do so. And under the letter of the law, that means you're committing treason against the United States, and there's a possibility that you could face death. So this is, a real possibility that the U.S. government could go down this road. I don't know how likely it is that he'll be extradited to the U.S. versus face charges in any number of countries that WikiLeaks has published documents about, or, possibly Sweden. So I really can't get into that, but a lot of the analysis being done right now is on the possibility that he ends up in the United States. And I did want to note that this indictment was from the Eastern Virginia District Federal Court. And so that would be the same court that John Kiriakou went through. And they discussed that pretty much everybody in the jury pool is going to be kind of upper class federal government employee or a government contractor. So everybody here has incentive, for the government and for the war machine and the empire to keep on churning. Now, there's also the issue here that they want. So now we know that the indictment exists and they want Chelsea Manning to testify because they think it'll prove that Julian Assange committed this crime. And Chelsea Manning is invoking her constitutional rights, first, fourth, and sixth, and she should be able to invoke her fifth as well to not testify here. However, they have thrown her in jail because she says, so basically they're trying to force her to testify in a courtroom mind you here, without any legal representation, and the questions won't be public. And it's a whole secret thing, so, she really won't be able to get any advice from counsel or anything like that, or, the information really couldn't leak out to the press at this time to explain what was asked. And, this is really important stuff. And anyways, the point is that they have this trial they're trying to have against Julian Assange, and part of the injustice of the whole thing is essentially they're trying to force a confession out of Chelsea Manning. And they even kept her in what they called administrative segregation, which is really just solitary confinement for the first several weeks that she was being held in prison. And mind you, she hasn't committed a crime other than invoking her constitutional rights rather than to testify to this federal grand jury. All right, so I'll continue to update the story as it unfolds. Like I said, there's a lot of possibilities here. Check out consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com, The American Conservative, and even Reason have all been putting out, really good journalism behind this, editorials on why it's important. And a lot of the reason of why it's important, not just because it's an injustice for Julian Assange, but because it's really an attack on journalism. And, something that Assange is apparently being charged for here is trying to get Chelsea Manning to give more information. And Bob Perry, who passed away a couple years ago, had explained several times that this is an important thing for journalists to be able to do, to ask their sources for more information. Hey, can you give me this? Does this program exist? And they're unable to do that. And if that's a crime, then, it makes people being able to whistleblow all that much less likely, and government's corruption crimes remain unexposed. And people say, what's a little corruption? Well, we're talking about torture here. We're talking about war crimes here. All right, on to some other stuff. The Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, said that he is working with the U.S. government to, foment dissent in the Venezuelan military. Again, I really haven't seen any evidence that this is working so far, and my guess is they're probably trying to dangle a lot of carrots out there in forms of high-ranking positions in the new government or lucrative contracts of some kind or another that would, enrich any general or military personnel that decide to defect and, try to coup Maduro. And so that, maybe that's the state of the regime change effort right now. We're not seeing, a whole lot publicly other than, random U.S. senators will come out and say, we need regime change. And, oh, look, they had a blackout today. That's proof that our sanctions are working, that a bunch of people apparently didn't have power for a few hours is exactly what we want to be happening in Venezuela. I also read a story that Castro reaffirmed the Cuban relationship with Venezuela. And I think this story really goes to show what a failure this interventionist U.S. foreign policy have been. We're looking at a small island off the coast of the U.S. that has, really just given a middle finger to the U.S. for years and years and years. We've continued to try to push the people of Venezuela, organized coups, assassination attempts, and have not been able to remove the Castro family from the head of Cuba. And that, they remain having ties with governments in the region that we impose, like Venezuela, who after the Chavez revolution, so this is 20 years, not many more decades like in Cuba, but the Chavez government and now the Maduro government have been able to continue to exist despite tons of U.S. effort to undermine them. And so if we can't orchestrate foreign policy in Central and Latin America, what chance do we ever have of having anything work out in the Middle East like we're trying to influence now? It's really kind of a crazy thing. The Pentagon awarded 2 contracts totaling $100 billion to build some miles of wall there on the southern border. This came from the DOD. I guess it's kind of the first of the Trump emergency fund money going down to the southern border. Now, of course, all the build a wall people, I just want to remind you what billion-dollar Pentagon projects tend to look like. Destroyer classes without weapons and F-35s that still, apparently malfunction quite a bit. We just had one go down in Japan just weeks after, the Japanese fleet became operational. And a little bit of positive news. It's a very small amount, but I'll throw in some on today's show. It's a Friday after all. Mike Pompeo said in some congressional testimony that the Trump administration wanted to leave a little bit of room for sanctions relief for North Korea in the event that it helps to facilitate a nuclear deal with the country. In that same congressional testimony, Senator Paul told the Secretary of State that the Trump administration does not have authority from Congress to go to war with Iran. And, this is an important stand to take in the days after the Trump administration declaring the IRGC a terrorist organization. Having the Senate come out and say, you absolutely do not have the authority to wage this war. Because that's apparently what it takes to prevent a war. Just not authorizing one obviously doesn't do the trick. Look at Yemen. Iran has responded some to the U.S. declaring the IRGC a terrorist organization. I'm not sure what sanctions now are going to apply to the IRGC that actually have all that much more bite than the current sanctions. But if I read some analysis on that and, some explanation as to what additional sanctions are here, and maybe it does prevent the IRGC from facilitating some payments to different groups. But my guess is that'll have little effect in Iran, just like all the sanctions the Trump administration has put on the country. It's important to remember that even with all these steps, Iran hasn't started making nuclear weapons. And so I don't know what more proof you need. To what brink you would have to push Iran and basically corner them and them continue to not make nuclear weapons when you have to say, okay, I guess there really isn't a desire from the Iranians to make these weapons. Iran did call the U.S. a state sponsor of terror, and in some cases, they make a good point, like in Syria, sponsoring the resistance to Assad, which had heavy elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and even a DIA memo told and warned Obama that, hey, if you continue to do this, you really risk building up an Islamic jihadic caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Iran also labeled CENTCOM a terrorist organization, I guess, in response to the U.S. policy there. I see this as, I guess, could only be a ceremonial thing and just as maybe a little bit of a middle finger to the U.S. Now, there's some scandal developing here with the Democratic Party. I don't want, get too out in front of it because as we saw with Russiagate, that, sometimes these scandals turn out to be not quite what you think. But there is a former Obama, I guess, member of his legal team facing charges related to the Mueller probe, kind of through Paul Manafort, related to a report that he produced to give to the Ukrainian president. And so, here we have an example again of not Russiagate. This isn't the whole scandal kind of thing, and just goes further to show that all those people that thought the Paul Manafort thing was going to be the one that proved Russiagate, it's absolutely not. I also read a story from, I think, USA Today, and I'll link to it in the show notes page because I'm very skeptical of it so far, but I do think it's interesting that there's Ukrainian prosecutors now coming forward publicly after attempting to contact the FBI directly in the United States, saying that they have evidence of U.S. politicians, mostly in the Democratic Party, guilty of crimes in Ukraine. It looks like Benjamin Netanyahu will have enough support from the new Knesset to form another government, and I believe this will be his 5th term as Israeli president. I have more news on that in the coming shows. I really haven't had much chance to read what this may mean for the Palestinian people and for Israeli policy towards Iran and other countries. All right, on to Sudan, where it looks like Bashir, the longtime dictator of Sudan, 30 years, they are saying, I guess the military of that country, that he is on his way out and they're going to take over until they could hold an election. Now, who knows if they ever give up power, and I don't know enough about Sudan to know what this means and if Bashar will be able to maybe form up enough of a military resistance to oppose it, how much he's going to fight. But this will be a story that continues to develop. Now, CNN actually did some good work on Sudan. I've been talking on the show about protests ongoing in Sudan over the past few months, but really I didn't have any information on the brutality of the protests other than a few deaths that were documented by international aid groups. CNN said journalists to these protests, and I guess were involved, or I guess were present for some of them, and then interviewed some victims of the government of Sudan who were beaten and tortured, including people who were put in what were called refrigerator sites, basically cold temperatures for a couple days. And, there's interviews with the victims there. If you want to know how horrific the Sudanese government has been to its own people. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for the week. I guess it's probably a little bit on the shorter side, but maybe take the time to check out one of the UND4J visuals and listen to some really smart people who have done, work over the past decades on, Julian Assange and what WikiLeaks has exposed and the importance of WikiLeaks. With that extra like 10 minutes or so with this short show. So anyways, I hope everybody's enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, Facebook, Libertarian Union, Twitter at KYAAALE, and patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.